All right, this is Etruscan chapter 6. The Etruscans are people that lived in central Italy around 700 BCE. So they would have been living at the same time that the Grecians were, and they would have known who the Greeks were, and vice versa. They would have gone to Greece, and the Grecians would have come and visited them in Italy. They are the people before the Romans, so they were there before the Romans settled in. Their culture is a little bit shrouded in mystery because ancient Roman writers tell us Etruscans were master architects and engineers and town planners, but we don't have a whole lot of their writing left. I mean, there's almost nothing left of them. But what we know is from what was in their tombs, just like the Egyptians. We know of them and what they were all about in their culture because of what was in their tombs. We know also that they left behind some wonderful bronze works, and they were much admired by the Greeks. Although the Etruscans were heavily influenced, the Romans and their language, it was quite different. Their written language was derivative of Greek, so the script was a derivative, but it's still quite obscure and unrelated to the Indo-European family languages. As I said, nothing survives of their written language, but it is interesting that that's the case because we know that they spread literacy throughout Italy. So they taught the Romans how to write, but it's strange that we have nothing that survives from their written language. Using Greek colonial cities as models, Etruscans shifted from village life to the urban civilization, established themselves in strongly fortified hilltop cities in modern-day Florence, Pisa, Siena, those type of places. The Etruscans emerged around Oriental period. So if you think about the time in right before the Archaic period in Orientalism, then that's the same time that they came about. By 6th century, they controlled most of northern and central Italy. However, their cities never united to form a city-state. And when you unite, that is what gives you strength. Rather than having a city-state in Siena and having a city-state in Pisa, there was no unification. And so when somebody would come in to take over, they were easily taken over by the Romans when they came to power because they never unified, which is really what their downfall was, unfortunately. Let's move to the map so you can see where most of their towns were. So looking here, you're in Florence, we're in Arezzo, we're in Rome and Vie and Saraveti. These are all areas that were the Etruscans. The ravages of time have destroyed much of what the Etruscans accomplished, but fortunately their tombs and their necropoli, which as you learned in Egypt, which is the city of the dead, do survive today. And elaborate burial practices seem to be linked to Asian customs because at that time there was nobody else that was doing this type of burial, which is called a tumuli. And we know that that is the case that perhaps somewhere in Asia Minor or in Korea, this type of burial was taking place, but certainly not in Greece or in Egypt or any of the other cultures in Mesopotamia. They were not doing this type of burial where it was slightly underground and then they had the tumuli over the top. When somebody died, they would be cremated and have an afterlife in the tomb, similar to the same ideas that the Egyptians had. One reason for the lack of evidence from the Etruscan culture is that their towns were buried under present-day cities, which is extremely difficult to excavate because they would just, put a bunch of dirt over the top and then start a whole nother culture. So if we were to dig down below Rome, we would find lots of ancient cultures. In fact, in Rome, when looking at the Pantheon, when we get to that later, you'll see that the Pantheon now is standing street level. But at the time when the Romans built it, it was about 4 feet higher. So you would have climbed up to it. So you know that over time that's exactly what they've done. They've just buried over previous cultures and just lived right on top of it. Eventually the Romans swallowed the Etruscan culture, taking from it what they could. So we're going to move on to the first piece. Oh, here's a picture of what their tombs look like. So it's similar to the style of Egyptians where they did lots of painting on the inside. I mean, this reminds me of Egyptian, even though it's really quite different. Even their bodies, the scale of it, the colors is really quite different. But the idea is very similar in that they would decorate their tombs for the afterlife. So let's move on to the first piece that you need to know, which is the sarcophagus of the spouses. This is from Saravidi, and it's 520 BCE. It's made of terracotta, and it's 6'7". Terracotta is a type of clay, so this is pretty sophisticated for the time, being that this is quite large. It's 6'7". So it would have had to have been made into 4 separate pieces and then put together. The theme on this is death and afterlife. The Etruscans preferred terracotta, stucco, and bronze for their sculpture, and seldom used stone. Terracotta sculptures were molded rather than carved, which speaks to their technological advancements, because knowing how to fire a kiln for something this size, because you would not have been able to just create this like you would from marble, where it's subtractive and it's solid. This whole thing would have had to have been hollow. So they must have had lots and lots of practice to be able to create something as spectacular as this. And known about the sophistication of kiln and how to fire and all of those things. So let's get a little bit of a closer look. Sarcophagus takes the form of a husband and wife reclining comfortably on a banqueting couch. We see them with these smiles. It's similar to the archaic smile, and we're very close in the same time as the Grecian archaic smile. Women held with much higher regard in Etruscan culture than they did in Grecian culture, or Egyptians for that matter. And they were very much a part of the lively discussions that took place. And this was really quite shocking to the Greeks when they would come to visit, because in their culture, women were very much secondary. The upper bodies are vertical with a squared shoulders, but the hips and legs seem to sink into the softness of the couch, sort of an unrealistic L shape. I mean, if you look at this, if I go back to the page before, you can see it's a little bit unrealistic, the shift in their body. But they have a warm smile greeting us, and it's somewhat like a memorial to the dead. The man is raised, and he would have been holding a drinking vessel, sort of an invitation to dine with him or to join them. The woman held what would have been a perfume flask or maybe a pomegranate, which were symbols for the eternal, for the afterlife. And let's move to the next page. Sarcophagus consists of 4 pieces, like I've already said, and it would have been brightly painted, just like Egyptian and just like Grecian. So lots of color. Although the figures are life-size, the ashes of the couples would have remained inside the sarcophagi. So they did use the sarcophagus to put the ashes in. There wouldn't have been a mummy inside of this, in other words. And they would have put the couple in there together. So let's take a look at the backside, and you can see the braided hair and the flowing drapery. And you can also see how awkward his feet are. They're kind of shifted in an odd way. They're relaxed. They're congenial, but not as formal as Egyptians, or even the earlier archaic, if you remember from the archaic Kuros.